Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Salam, kamay So we're going to go ahead and get started. Of course, this is our 4th year commemoration of the Tigray genocide. Before I pass it on to Simon, our host, I just wanted to thank a few people, and then we'll pass it on, and then I'll also do a 1-minute moment of silence before we move to our host. So here we are. Co-hosts, please help admit people. They're still coming in. So on behalf of SJT, Security and Justice for Tigrayans, and all organizations that are organizing with us, I would like to thank our participants, our panelists. Thank you for saying yes, and thank you for being here. I would also like to thank the media outlets that are broadcasting this. So TMH, Axumawian Media, Tigray Online, DW, Dimswayani, Tigray Press, Hakfen Media, IVM, Erob Voice Media, Teddy Press, Tafetawit Show, and Amaniel Show. Thank you all for participating and broadcasting this. And then I would also like to thank a few individuals for making this week a success already. Dr. Tekka, Yasmina, Dr. Mahatama, Melat Mohammed, Simon Tesfai, Aita Mesfin, Samrawit Silva, Nagusti Mame, and Zion from the Anastion Summit America, Mahalet Gabramedin and Team Omna, Johannes and Siiru from Team Canada, Marhawi from Boston, Elsa Hagos, Militsi Brahana Mescal, Takla Brahan, Wadi Berber, Alula Solomon, Angasom, Dr. Bitzer Zemen, Helena Haile Selassie, Michael Berhe, Simon Hagos, Kowalski Mullis, Brother Jeff, Dr. Haile, Dr. Gide, Brahane from Dallas, Tesfai from Irobanina, Dr. Gide, Dr. Haile, and Team SJT, Advocacy and PR team. So I would like to thank these folks for making this week a success already. So now let's take a moment, and if we are able, please stand up, and then a moment of silence for the victims of Tigray genocide. 1 minute, please. Starting now. Rafti, thank you so much. Simon, are you there? We'll let Simon come in next. Let's go for opening remarks to Dr. Mahatema, and then we'll come back to the host, Simon, here shortly. Dr. Mahatema, you can go ahead. Dr. Mahatema, welcome. Your opening remarks, please. Thank you.
Okay, Onele Dani. ዝኸበርኩምን ዝኸበርክንን ዕድማት ተሳተፍቲ ዝኸበርኩም መራሕቲ ወዳበታትን ኣባላትን ዲያስፖራ ትግራይን ማስ ሜድያ ትግራይን ዝኸበርኩም ብመራኸብቲ ሓፋሽ ኣብ ምክትታል እትርከቡ ወገናትና ዝኸበርክንን ዝኸበርኩምን ሎሚ ዝተረኸብናሉ ዋና ምኽንያት መበል 4 ዓመት ምጽናት ዓልየት ህዝቢ ትግራይ ዝተኣወጀሉ ዕለተ ጥቅምቲ 24 2013 ወይ ኖቨምበር 3 2020 ብኣቆጻጽራ ፈረንጂ ንምዝካር ኮይኑ ዓለም ለኻዊ ተልእኾ ሒዙ ኣብ ምቅላስ ዝርከብ ውዳበ ድሕንነትን ፍትሕን ንትግራዎት Security and Justice for Tigrayans SJT ምስ ካልኦት መዳርግቲ ውዳበታት ኣሜሪካ ኣውሮፓን ካናዳን ብምዃን ኣዘዳለናዮ ዓለም ለኻዊ ናይ ፓነል ዘተ ብምስታፍኩም ብጣዕሚ ክነመስግን ንፈቱ እቲ ሎምን ንዘለኣሎምን እናተዘከረ ክነብር ዝግብኦ ጉዳይ ጀኖሳይድ ትግራይ ዝተፈላለዩ ክፋላት ዘለውዎ ኮይኑ እቱ በቀዳምነት ንዝክሮ ኣብ ልዕሊ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ጀኖሳይድ ምፍጻሙ እዩ ኣብ ልዕሊ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ጀኖሳይድ ዝፈጸሙን ዘፈጸሙን ድማ መንግስቲ ኢትዮጵያ ኤርትራን ኣምሓራን እዮም እቶም ብሚልዮን ዝግመት ህዝቢ ትግራይ ክሃልቅ ዝገበሩ በአብይ አሕመድ ዓሊን ብርሃኑ ጁላን ዝተመርሐ መንግስትን ሰራዊትን ኢትዮጵያ በኢሳያስ አፈወርቂ ዝተመርሐ መንግስቲ ኤርትራን መንግስቲ ኤርትራን ሰራዊቱን በክልላዊ መንግስት አምሓራ ዝተመርሐ ሰራዊት ፍሉይ ኃይሊ ፋኖን ምልሻን እንትኾኑ ኩሎም ጸላእትና بسموم ولا قا مسرح انت زي كالنا بوانانتن بقدامنتن نصرحهم صلاتن متنتن حزب تግራይ አብይ አሕመድ ዓሊ ኢሳያስ አፈወርቂ ደመቀ መኮንን ተመስገን ጥሩነህ አገኘው ተሻገር ገዱ አንዳርጋቸው ዳንኤል ክብረት ጀነራል አበባው ታደሰ ኮሎኔል ደመቀ ዘውዱን ካልኦትን ተኸታተልቶም እዮም እዚኦም ኣብ ጽንተት ህዝቢ ትግራይ ዝለዓለ ግደ ዝነበሮም ብምዃኑ ንዘለኣሎሙ እናተኾነኑ ክነብሩን በቀዳምነት ኣብ ጀኖሳይድ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ተሓተቱ ክኾኑ ዝግብኦም እዮም ኣብ ዝኽሪ ምጽናት ዓልየት ትግራይ ንዘለኣሎሙ እናዘከርናዮም ዝነብሩ ግዳያት ወገናትና ድማ ኣብ ሰለስተ ኸፊልና ምርኣይ ይግባእ በቀዳምነት ንዝክሮ ግዳያት ትግራይ ንምውራርን ትግራዎት ንምጽአትን ዝመጹ ሰራዊታት ጸላእቲ ንምምካት ዝተሰውኡ በአማይታ ሸሓት ዝቁጸሩ መናእሰይን ዓበይትን ተጋደልቲ ትግራዎት ዝምልከት እዩ እቶም ብኻልኣይ ብርኪ እንዝክሮም ግዳያት ትግራዎት እንካብ ገገዝኦም እናተሃደኑን እናሳደዱን ቀቲሎም ኣካሎም ብሰራዊት ብኣራዊት ክብልሑ ብገደላት ክጸድፉ ብገመድ ተኣሲሮም ናብ ሩባ ተከዘ ብምድርባይ ብውሕጅ ክውሰዱ ዝገበርዎም መናእሰያት ዓበይትን አረጋውያንን እንትኾኑ በማይቲ ኣሽሓት ዝቁጸራ ዝተዓመፃን ስነኣእምራዊ ጉድኣት ዝበፅሐን ደቂ ኣንስትዮና እውን ዝምልከት እዩ እቶም ብሳልሳይ ብርኪ እንዝክሮም ግዳያት ትግራይ ንብረቶም ብናይ ጸላእቲ ሰራዊት ዝተሰርቁን ዝተቃጸሉን ብምዃኑ ብዕፅዋን ክባን ምኽንያት ዝብላዕ ዝስተን መድሓኒትን ስኢኖም ብጥሜት መንሚኖምን ብሕማም ተሳቂዮምን ዝሃለቁ በአማይተ ሸሓት ዝግመቱ ግዳያት ወገናትና ዝምልከት ጉዳይ እዩ በዚህ መሰረት ኩሎም ግዳያት ትግራይ ምዝክራ ኣድላይ ይኸውን ንሃገሮምን ህዝቦምን ምክልኻል ዝተሰውኡ ብዘይ ኣፈላላይ ብጭካኔ ብሓይልታት ጸላእቲ ዝተቐተሉ ምግብን መድሓኒትን ብምስኣት ህይወቶም ዝሰኣኑን እንትዝከሩ እንዝከረሉ ዕለት ኮይኑ ከምኡ እውን ዝተዓመፃን ስነ ኣእምራዊ ስንባደ ዝበፅሐን ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ትግራይ ምፅምዕናዕን ምሕብሓብን ከም ዘድሊ ተረዲእና እንመያየጠሉ ዝግባእ ጉዳይ እዩ ዝኽሪ ምጽናት ዓልየት ኩናት ትግራይ ንዘለኣለሙ እናተዘከረ ንኽነብር ብዙሓት ሰራዊት ብዙሓት ስራሕቲ ከነጻፍፎም ዝግብኡና ከም ዘለዎ ኣብ ግምት ብምእታው ኣብዚ ናይ ዘተ መድረኽ ተራኺብና እነመሓልፎም ሓሳባት ነቶም ግዳያት ንምዝካር ህዝብና ኣብቲ እዋን ኩናት ዝተፃወሮ ግፍዒ ከም ሕሉፍ ታሪኽና ንምዝካር እንካብኡ ተማሂርና ንመጻኢ ተጻብኦታት ንምምካት ዝሕግዝ መንገዲ ንምርኣይ እዩ ዝኽርታትና ነቲ ናይ ምጽናት ዓልየት ከብጽሑ ዝኽእሉ ስነ ሓሳባትን ተግባራትን ከምኡ እውን ንኡ ንምክልኻል እንታይ ክንገብር ከም እንኽእል ኣብ ግምት ክነእቱ ዝግበአና እዩ ንግዳያትን ብህይወት ንዝተረፉ ስድራ ግዳያትን ከምኡ ተጋደልትን ክብሪ ንምሃብን ዘኽብርን እዩ ማሕበረሰብ ትግራይ ነቶም ግዳያት ፍሉይ ጠመተ ሂቡ እንትዝክር እቲ መንእሰይ ወለዶ ካብ ሕሉፍ ታሪኻት ህዝቦም ክመሃሩ ዘተባብዖም ከም ዝኸውን እዩ ኩናት ጽንተት እንትንዝክር ከለና ከምዚ ዓይነት ግፍዒ ፈጺሙ ንኸይድገም ቃል እናኣትወሉ መንገዲ ምዃኑ እዩ ዝኽሪ ኩናት ምጽናት ዓልየት ንተምሃሮን ዓበይትን ብዛዕባ ጀኖሳይድ ፍልጠትን ንቕሓትን ንከማዕብሉ ዝሕግዞም ይኸውን ንሕና እውን ኣብ ምጽናት ዓልየት ከብጽሑ ዝኽእሉ ስነ ሓሳባትን ተግባራትን ከምኡ እውን ኣብ ምክልኻል ክውሰዱ ዝግብኦም ስጉምትታት ክንሓስብ ዝሕግዘና እዩ ብሓፈሽኡ ኣብ ቅድሜና ንጽበዮ ነዊሕ ናይ ቃልሲ እዋን ምዃኑ ተረዳዲእና ኣብ ትግራይ ዝበፅሐ ጀኖሳይድ ኣብ ዓለም መድረኻት ኣፍልጦ ረኺቡ ንኽዝከር ገበነኛታት ንክሕተቱ ግዝኣታዊ ሓድነት ትግራይ ተረጋጊጹ ዝተመዘበለን ዝተሰደደን ህዝብና ናንበረበቱ ንክምለስ ናይ ሕይወትን ዕብየትን ስራሕቲ ንምስላጥ ዝኽእሉ ትምህርታዊ መልእኽትታት ንክመሓለፉ መድረኽ ዘኽእል እዩ ኣብ መዛዘምብየ ክብሎ ዝደሊ ኣብ ናይ ሎሚ ውራይና ኣብ ፖለቲካዊ ትኩሳት ትግራይ ኣልዒልና እንዝትየሉ መድረኽ ከም ዘይኮነ ክነዘኻኽር ንፈቱ ዕለታዊ ትኹረትናን እነቕርቦም ሓሳባትን ኣብቲ ዝበፅሐ ጀኖሳይድ ውዕሊ ፕሪቶርያ ጉዳይ ኣፍልጦ ጀኖሳይድን ጉዳይ ተሓታትነትን ቀጸልተይ ኣንፈታትናን ኣብ ዘድህቡ ክኸውን ይምረጽ ዕውት ዘተ ንክህልወና ንምነ የቕኒልና
Thank you, Dr. Mahatem. Our host, Simon, is here. Before I pass on to him, Mahalet Mohammed is also going to be a host. Unfortunately, she was not able to make it due to family emergency. Simon, I will pass it to you.
I'm not sure if my audio is clear enough, but I'd like to thank everybody for coming to this commemoration Zoom meeting. I'm sorry for the technical problem that I had earlier, but finally it looks like it's working. So, today is the day that we remember the fallen heroes that we've had. Our brothers, our family, our people have gone through hell since November 3rd of 2020. And since then, not just the lives of our people back home has been changed, but rather our lives here in the US, across the world, in the West, and all over the world, as I said earlier, has been changed due to that war. And moving forward, we want to commemorate that day to remember that being a Tigrayan has a cost to it. It's basically an identity that has been built based on bloods and bones that are being crushed across the years. So today is a very special day as we mourn a lot of losses. We need to remember that we thrive when when we get hit, we thrive over it. We stumble it and become a better nation as a whole. So thank you everybody for coming to today's event. Next, we have a speaker that usually inspires me. I love him to death. He's one of our committed advocates in the West. His name is Dr. Taka. I would like to welcome him to the stage and give him the mic.
Thank you, Simon. Kwa Tiganana. Zinai SJT every year Ilgawro. Hizb Tigray لحلفو هلكيت كذكر سلالله كدقام يولي every year ندقمو إنا عمن نذكرو إنا إنا تاينا كنذكر قبل حالف سلسة 4 عامت تاينا كنقبر لمثلا نكبلية مالتيونا هزب تجراي انتهلق تجراي تفرس مناقسي تجراي بحدنت تسلفهم لتجراي كدحنو من تجراي أبحاد وجودقاد انتقبروا دياسبورا تجراي لما هم حادثة وينهم تنابيبهم بادفوكسي دبلوماسي petition global and national protest عويلهم لتجراي صحاي قري بتسبهم سرحهم ليبالو لحزب تجراي كقالسو تلو لصلاتي حزب تجراي እንደገና ሰንሰን አብለው መሸንፈም ከሸንፉን ተለው ይዝከረኒ هم ሓደ ትግራዋይ ሓቦ ሓበን ክብሪ ኩርዓት ውን ይስምዓኒ ተጋሩ በዓለም ለለና ናይ ፕሪቶሪያ ውዕል ክፍረም ተሎ ህዝብና ለሃለቆል ጦርነት ተጣሉ ወለሉ ስለዝኾነ ኩልና ተጋሩ همመጠን ህዝቢ መናእሰይ ትግራይ እቲ ጅግና ህዝቢ ትግራይ ብልኸፈለ መስዋዕትነት ለተገና ዓውይ ዓወት ስለዝኾነ ህዝብና ህዝብ ትግራይ እፎየሉ ወለሉ ዓውይ ተስፋ ለግነየሉ ግዜ ኢነይሩ ኣብላ ሓለፈ ናይ ትግራይ ቃልሲ ትግራይ ዳያስፖራ ብኩሉ ዓይነቱ ተሳቲፉ እዩ በአድቮካሲ ዲፕሎማሲ ስራሕትታት ፕላስ ፈንድራይዚንግ መኸተ ሓደ መኸተ ክልተ መኸተ ሰለስተ ካብ ልግባእ ለላዕሊ ተሳቲፉ ብሚልዮናት ዶላራት ተኣኪቡ ላብ ትግራይ ተሰዲዱ እስካብ ሕዚ ናይ ትግራይ መራሕቲ ክንድዚ ልኾን ገንዘብ በፂሕና ብፀብፃብ ስለለረዶና እቲ ዳያስፖራ ብጣዕሚ ሓዝን ብጣዕሚና ሓዚና including myself ብትልርዮ ዘለኹ ካብ ዳያስፖራ ዓብይ ሽግር ለለና እውን እቲ ትራንስፓረንሲ ስለለየግነና ስለለየብልና እዩ እና እስካዕ ተሓቅሉ ፃረ ንቃለሲና ቃልሲ ዳያስፖራ ስሎው ዳውን ኮይኑ ስፔሻሊ ድሕሪ ናይ ፕሪቶሪያ አግሪመንት ናይ ዝዓብይ ምኽንያት ድማ ኣብ ውሽጢ ትግራይ ኩሎም መራሕቲ ትግራይ ናይ ኣነ መጨረሽታ ለይብሉ ሕትኽቱኽ ልፈጠር ዓብይ ሽግር እንትኾን እቲ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ተረሲዑ እታ ትግራይና ተረሲዓ እቲ አይዲፒና ተረሲዑ እቲ ዳያስፖራ እዚ ብምዕዛብ እዚ ብምርኣይ ብጣዕሚ ተቆጢዑ ብጣዕሚ ሓዝን ተጋሩ ኣብዚ ለለናዮ ኩነታት ኣነ ሃምኽር ገይረልዎ ዓድና ስለልኾነ ህዝብና ስለልኾነ ተጋሩ ኣብዚ ለለናዮ ኩነታት ናይ ትግራይ ናይ ህዝብና ሽግር ተረዲኡና ሓድነትና ጠንኪርና እቲ ልጀመርናዮ ቃልሲ ክንውደው ኣለና መልእኽቲ ለመንእሰይ ትግራይ ዳያስፖራ በተለይ ኣብዚ ካብ ትግራይ ወፃኢ ተወሊዶም ለዓበዩ ደቂ ትግራይ ኣብቲ ሕማቅ ግዜ ዝሰርሕዎ ዓብይ ስራሕ ሰሪሖም ስለዝኾኑ ህዝቡን ኣብዚ ኸዚ ግዜ ልጅግና ህዝብና ኣብ ሜዳ ደብርናዮ ክንኸድ የብልናይ ብፅንዓት ክንቃለስ እቶም ክሪሚናልስ ላብ ጀስቲስ ክነምፆም ኣለና ኣብዚ ብእውነት ስለና ዳያስፖራ በተለይ መንእሰያት ኣነ ኣብዚ ሓለፈ 3-4 ዓመት ኢድ ኮይነ ኣብዚ ለለኹም መብዛሕትኹም ሰሪሐ ብጣዕሚ ካብ ልገርሙኒ ብጣዕሚ ንርአ ስራሕ ልቁፀር ልፅብፀብ ስራሕ ልሰርሑ ግን እዞም ኣብዚ ተወሊዶም ለዓበዩ ቆልዑ ወንጫ ማይ ሰትዮም ላለ ይፈልጡ ዓዲ ብልተፈላለየ ዓይነት ብፍለጡ ጎደናታት ልሓፀዩ ኣብ ዓለም ዘለዉ መራሕትታት ኣዌር ብልኾንሉ መንገዲ ንህዝቢ ትግራይ ዋሕሲ ጠባቃይ ብልኾን መንገዲ ዓብዪ ስራሕ ሰሪሖም እዮም እዞም መንእሰያት ደቂ ትግራይ ደቂ ዓድና እና ብዚ ዓይነት መንገዲ እዚ ልበዓል ዳኒ ብምሎም ኣብዚ ዘለኹም መራሕቲ ስለዝኾንኩም ሳላ እዚኦም ጠንከራታት ዝኾኑ መንእሰያት ኖማዓንቲ ኤቭሪ ይር እንገብሮ እንሰርሖ እሞ ክስምዐልና እንደሊ ክንገረልና እንደሊ ግን ከይድገም እንደገና ብልተፈላለየ መንገዲ ብናይ ፕሪቶሪያ ይኹን ብናይ ተፈላለየ መንገዲ ብናይ አይዲፒ ናይ ብምሉኡ ለሎ ትግራይ ዓድና ሽግር ኤክስፖዝ ኮይኑ ብዓለም ደረጃ ክፍለጥ ብልተፈላለየ መንገዲ ናይ ዓለም መራሕትታት ክርድኦም ዝገብሩ ዘለዉ ኣሕዋትና ዓበይቲ እዮም ዕድመ ብዓብየ የኾነይ ዓበይቲ ሰባት ማለት ዓብዪ ስራሕ ዝሰርሕ ሰብ እዩ እዚኦም ደቅና እዚኦም መንእሰያት ዓበይቲ ሰባት እዮም እና ብጣዕሚ እየ ዝኮርዐሎም በተለይ እልዳኒ ዝገብርዎ ዘለዉ ብኣድቮካሲ ናይ ኤስጂቲ ናይ ኣድቮካሲ መራሒ እዩ ብምሉኦም ቶም ናይ ኤስጂቲ ዶክተር ማተመ ያስሚናቶም መራሕቲ ፕላስ እዚኦም ኣብዚ ዘለዉ ናይ ተፈላለዩ ናይ ትግራይ ዳያስፖራ ናይ ኣድቮካሲ መራሕቲ ሪች ኣውት እንዳገበረ እስኪ ናይ ባዕልና ኣብ ጎኒ ንግበሮ ንፕሪቶሪያ ንሓግዝ ንህዝቢ ትግራይ ንሓግዝ እናበለ እንገብሮ ዘሎ ናይ ምጉያየት ናይ ሪች ኣውት ምግባር ናይ ብሓደ ኮይኖም ደብዳቤ ምፅሓፍ ለየድንቕዎ ክሓልፍ ይደሊ ኤስጂቲ ዝፀሓፎ ለውፅኦ መፅሓፍ ልምሻጥ ኣብ ትግራይ ዝግበሩ ኢቨንታት ናይ ባዕሉ ኤርቲኬት እናቆረፀ እላኸደ መፅሕፍቲ ክሸጥ ምክንያቱም ትሸጠ መፅሕፍቲ ለይቲ ናይ ቲዲኤፍ ተጎድኡ ኣሕዋትና ስለዝኾኑ ለይዓደግኩም ተሊኹም እውን ዓድጉ እዚ ዝገብሩ ኣሕዋትና እዮም ዘለዉ ብዝና ጊቭ ኣፕ ለይገበሩ እቶም መንእሰያት ኢድ ተደሓሒዞም ንሕና መብዛሕትና ለይንገብሮ ነገር እላሰርሑ ንህዝብና ዋሕሲ ጠበቃይ ኮይኖም ዝገብሩ ዘለዉ እዚ እንድሕር ኣቋሪፅናዮ ንሕና በቃ ተወዲእና ማለት እዩ እዞም ቆልዑ እዚኦም እንከረጅ ክንገብሮ ብለና ቆልዑ ይኾኑ ፒኤችዲ ዳክተርስ ባችለር ዲግሪ ብዙሕ ዘለዎም ቆልዑ ይኾኑ ዓበይቲ ሰባት እዮም ዓብዪ ስራሕ ላሰርሑ ንህዝቢ ትግራይ ብጣዕሚ ቃትሪ ለይቲ ክሬዲት ካርድ ላኣተዉ መኪናኦም ላሸጡ ገዝኦም ላሸጡ ንህዝቢ ትግራይ ዝሓገዙ መንእሰያት እዮም ኣብ ዓለም ውሽጢ ዘለዉ እና ኣይዞኹም ይርድአና እዩ ትሰርሕዎ ዘለኹም ስራሕ ብጣዕሚ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ፈልጦ እዩ ለዘለኣለም ብቀይሕ ቀለም ፅሒፉ ኣብ ናይ ትግራይ ታሪክ ልነብር ዓብዪ ታሪክኩም ትሰርሑ ዘለኹም እዚ ናይ ኖማዓንቲ ካልእ ዝበሃሎ ነገር የብሊ ዝበፅሐና ሽግር ንዝከረሉ ካልኣይ ድማ ከይድገም ንህዝቢ ዓለም ንፋልጠሉ ባዕልና እውን እቶም ተወድኡ ለትግራይ ንሕና ክንህሉ ዝገብሩ ናይ መጨረሻ መተካእታ ዘይብላ ሂወቶም ለጥፍኡ ኣሕዋትና ጀጋኑ ደቂ ትግራይ እንዝክረሉ መዓልቲ እዩ እላ ዘከርና ንነብር ኢና ብዛ ዓይነት መንገዲ እዚ ብጣዕሚ ከመስግነኩም ይደሊ ኣነ ኣብዚኣ ይውድእ ተንኪዩ ልትትገብርዎ ዘለኹም ኣማራጭ የብልናይ ኩልና ዝኸኣልናዮ ክንገብር ለና ትግራይ ክንሕግዝ ብዓድና ክንሕበን ህዝብና ክንሕግዝ ትግራይና ክንሕግዝ thank you so much ወዲ ኣለኹ
Thank you very much Dr. Teka. That was a very inspiring speech. The biggest thing that he said that I really like is we got to make sure this doesn't happen again. I think that should be the priority of every single Tigrayan across the world. The biggest thing that we can do is educate ourselves about the history, right? What actually happened, how it happened, so that we can avoid it. And especially to our kids, to the young ones, we have to document and pass the knowledge and the history and what actually happened in the past since the war started. So that was a very good, inspiring speech, Dr. Teka, as usual. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Danny so that he can introduce our next keynote speaker. Danny, you can go ahead and take the mic.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Of course, we have the keynote speaker, Dr. Azim Ibrahim, or Professor Ibrahim. He's the Senior Director at New Alliance Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C., where he chairs the Mass Atrocities and International Law portfolio. He received his PhD from University of Cambridge, after which he completed fellowships at universities of Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Dr. Ibrahim is an author of the seminal book, The Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Hidden Genocide, for which he received in 2019 an International Association Genocide Scholars Award. And as you all know, he's an expert and leader contributing to the New Lines Institute report on genocide in Tigray. Dr. Azim Ibrahim, please take the mic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danny, for inviting me. And thank you so much to the rest of the organizers to have me here today. My dear brothers and sisters from Tigray and elsewhere, I'm not going to sit here and tell you about the situation in Tigray and what's happening there and the events surrounding it. This is information that you know much better even than myself. But I will tell you about my experience in undertaking this report and what I have learned on the way and how this report came about. So a few years ago, our institute, the New Lines Institute, undertook a report on the breaches of the Genocide Convention in China against the Uyghur population. That report was very successful. We had over 55 top legal scholars contribute to that, and that report was subsequently used by the US State Department to make the genocide determination against China. Subsequent to that, I was asked to do a report on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and whether that met the genocidal the criteria. I traveled to Ukraine 2 weeks after the invasion, and on my return, I put together a team of experts, open source intelligence experts, legal experts, etc., to make a determination if Russia's war was genocidal in nature. That report was also used in 13 parliaments around the globe to vote for genocide, to recognize the war as a genocide. So it was only proper and appropriate that after we have undertaken those reports, we look at one of the bloodiest and most horrific conflicts since the end of the Cold War and what's happening in Tigray. So for the last 2.5 years, my team and I have been looking at this situation. The report was led by a group of scholars, over a dozen of them. And if you look at the report, you'll see their names, people of the utmost highest caliber. These included 2 former attorney generals from Canada, Australia, former justice ministers, former ICJ judges and prosecutors, the former founder of the Yugoslav Tribunal, and people like Baroness Helena Kennedy, the director of the Human Rights Commission in the UK. So people of the utmost caliber. And the result was the most extensive and detailed report on what's happening in Tigray in terms of the Genocide Convention. The report was over 80,000 words and over 230 pages. So after the report was published, we undertook an extensive effort to get this information to policymakers around the globe. We started with our trips to the UN. We met with the missions and ambassadors of Canada, US, UK and Ireland. We then went to Ottawa, where we had the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Canada host us, and we gave a presentation in Canada on the findings of this report. And then we followed up with meetings with various Canadian ministers. After this, we went to Washington, DC. We had meetings with 9 different congressional offices, the US State Department, the Holocaust Museum, and even the directors of the National Security Council at the White House. And most recently, we launched this report in the UK with the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Tigray. And we then went to Brussels to meet with the deputy leaders of the 2 major political parties, along with the chief whip. Now, the most interesting thing throughout all of my discussions with all of these policymakers all over the world is that there was a number of key findings which I realized, which I want to share with you. First of all, Tigray is not on their agenda at all, no matter where I went. Some of them were aware of it. Some of them had absolutely no idea what's happening in Tigray. In Europe in particular, they had absolutely no idea what's happening in Tigray. Lots of them had an understanding of what's happening in Darfur and Sudan, but Tigray simply was not on their agenda. And much of the information that we gave them came as a surprise. They thought the Tigray war was over. and that there's now a transitional justice, a peace process going on. So we had to highlight to them the necessity of looking at this issue again and bringing it back onto the agenda of policymakers. And the second thing we realised is that those that were aware of Tigray, this just was not a priority for them. You know, they just didn't know what to do, and they didn't know how to do this. So this is very important to know, because every country that we met, they were willing to do something, but they didn't want to take the lead. They didn't want to take the lead themselves. They basically said that, look, if somebody else is doing something, then we will join them, but we are not going to take the lead. This is just not a priority, a strategic priority for our nation. So that's also very important to know. And the third thing that I learned is that the Tigrayan organizations, you know, all very well-meaning, and I have met many of you over the last year or so, is that they're not united and realistic in their asks in terms of how to get this issue back onto the agenda. I've spoken to many of you in different capitals around the globe. I recognize some of the names, you know, in Ottawa, New York, and Washington, and London, and elsewhere. Is that the Tigrayan, all the different Tigrayan organizations, they are all working in different ways and asking for different things. And this is just not realistic, and it's not essentially an effective strategy. So what I am actually going to do, I actually have a call set up with some of the Tigrayan leaders on November 9th of this month, which is essentially next week, in which we will go over some of the key things that the Tigrayan groups should be doing and looking at doing to essentially get this onto the agenda and trying to get some movement on this. I have worked on some of these issues in the past, you know, whether it's the Rohingya, whether it's the Uyghur, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's others. Change comes very slowly. Yeah, all of your efforts have to be focused on a very, very small, narrow objective. Yeah. And this is the way it happens. This is always the first step. It has to be something very small, very easy, and that's easy to for a policymaker to achieve. So this could be something just like issuing a statement, your local member of parliament issuing a statement, signing a letter, saying that, look, we are deeply concerned with what's happening in Tigray. Justice has not been delivered. The UK, the US, Canada, whatever country it may be, needs to examine this in a little bit more detail. We need more attention on this. It's a simple letter from your member of parliament. That's usually the first step. Then you have to kind of build upon that in terms of next steps, trying to force the respective governments to call for an independent commission of inquiry, no longer relying on outside forces. And so each of these things, I will go over them in my call on the 9th of November. The thing is that I am the director of a think tank. You know, I cannot do this kind of advocacy work. I don't have the bandwidth for it. I don't have the resources for it. But you do, the Tigrayan people, and I have some very good people from my team who help guide this process to try to make sure that this issue is back onto the agenda. And this is a real issue. The other thing which I will also mention as well is that we are very much keen on doing follow-up reports on the Genocide in Tigray report. So I'm now in consultation with a number of scholars looking at two very, very important and very horrific issues that are in Tigray. One of them is the conflict-related sexual violence that's happening in Tigray, and it's still ongoing. And the other one is forced starvation of Tigrayan people. So I'm actually in the process right now putting together a team of scholars that will be looking at these issues. But once again, it all comes back to the same thing, is that this heavy lifting, this advocacy, this outreach has to be done by the Tigrayan community, has to be done by the Tigrayan organizations, and it has to be done in a united, cohesive fashion. And you have to do this step by step. I totally understand that your community, your people, your family members are experiencing genocide and experiencing crimes of the most horrific nature, but things will have to be done in a realistic and slow fashion. I have seen this with every community that I've dealt with. The expectations are very unrealistic. You know, nobody is going to go there and address Abiy Ahmed. Nobody is going to send troops into the region to secure the region or invade or send missiles or anything like that. these things take a lot of time. You have to you have to take very, very small steps and build up. And there's some things that are low-hanging fruits that you can do very easily if you can get all your community, all the Tigrayan organizations together and start bringing awareness to what is happening. Because quite frankly, I met with people at the highest level. I met with the heads of the Africa desk in many of these countries, the heads of the Africa Affairs Bureau, ambassadors, etc. People have no idea what's happening in Tigray. This is the reality. They think, yes, this is the peace process is going on. Abiy Ahmed is doing his best. We are focusing on normalization of relationships with the Ethiopians. Yes, there's some crimes going on here and there, but this is not the explicit policy of the government. So we have to change that perception, and we can only do this if everybody works together on single small objectives. And with that, I look forward to my colleagues who will be organising this discussion on the 9th of November. Please reach out to them. And I look forward to seeing as many Tigrayan organisations there as possible so we can start developing a clear, coherent strategy, one step at a time, everybody focused on it until we reach success on these issues. And with that, I'll pass it back to the chair, Danny. Thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for listening.
We are so grateful, Professor Azim. Thank you so very much. And I do have the Zoom link, and I will be sharing your meeting on the 9th, and I'll share it with the organizations that are here. Thank you again. Simon, back to you.
Thank you very much, Danny, and I want to say thank you to Dr. Ibrahim. Your work has been magnificent, and we really do appreciate it. I want to go ahead and pass the mic to my friend Samrawit. She's going to go ahead and take over the mic to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Simon. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all. I am actually going to be talking about the action items. And I just want to start off by saying thank you so much to Dr. Azim and the New Lines Institute for the critical work that they continue to do on behalf of Tigray. And just to say that this report is not just a document, it's a call for justice and accountability for those who have and continue to endure unimaginable suffering, as we all know. And we're just deeply grateful as a community to the New Lines Institute for the dedication and 2.5 years long research, which helps bring the truth to light. And it also provides a solid foundation for action. So following this very important report and with the invaluable efforts of OMNA Tigray, we now have a petition that calls on the international community to act. And this petition can be found on the OMNA Tigray website. I'm also going to be putting a link to it in the chat right now. And currently it's available for those in the United States, Canada, UK, and Europe. And we are actively working to make it accessible for those in Australia as well. So let me go ahead and put it in the chat. This petition is really essential because it lays out the urgent actions that we're asking governments to take. And it's really important that we're gonna all take 2 minutes to read it together. Oh, let me put it in the group chat right now. I'm in the chat right now. So I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm hoping that, you all will also read it again when you're signing it, but just going ahead and taking the 2 minutes to read it. So this is what the petition reads. So it goes, as your constituent, I urge you to take immediate, decisive action to recognize the atrocities committed in Tigray as genocide, to protect human rights, secure humanitarian aid access, and pursue justice for the victims. Since November 2020, Tigray has faced a devastating assault led by the Ethiopian National Defense Force, Amhara Special Forces, and Eritrean Defense Forces, displacing and ethnically cleansing over 2.2 million people and leaving millions in dire need. Despite a formal cessation of hostilities in 2022, credible reports indicate that mass atrocities, including targeted attacks on civilians, ethnic cleansing, and destruction of vital infrastructure, continue. The genocide has also endured Tigray's minority groups, including the Irob and Kunama communities, who are now facing near extinction. The Europe homelands have been occupied by settler forces, subjecting them to ethnic cleansing that threatens their survival. These targeted actions exacerbate the plight of minority groups in Tigray, further underscoring the need for independent international intervention to protect all vulnerable populations within the region. The New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, a respected authority on human rights, concludes that there is a reasonable basis to believe that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Amhara Special Forces, and the Eritrean Defense Forces have committed genocide against Tigrayans. The report details how these forces engaged in killing, inflicted serious harm, imposed life-threatening conditions, and enacted measures to prevent births, all with intent to destroy the Tigrayan ethnic group. It also highlights Ethiopia's failure to prevent these acts in violation of its obligation under the Genocide Convention. This genocide, coupled with mass killings, rape, ethnic cleansing, and starvation targeting Tigrayans, demands a unified and urgent response from the international community to end the violence and ensure accountability, and it goes to list the requests. So here are the 6 requests. First one is the official recognition of genocide. So support the recognition of these acts as genocide, affirming the findings of credible investigations and holding responsible parties accountable. The second request is independent criminal investigation. So advocate for an impartial international investigation to ensure justice for the victims, led by the International Criminal Court or a similar body. The third ask is exercise universal jurisdiction for accountability. So encourage the use of universal jurisdiction to prosecute those responsible for orchestrating or committing these crimes. The fourth is protection of vulnerable minority groups and their inclusion in justice and accountability efforts. So implement measures to protect minority groups such as the Irob and Kunama, who are at risk of extinction due to ethnic cleansing and occupation of their homelands. Include crimes committed against these minorities as part of investigations into atrocities committed against Tigrayans and determination of genocide. The fifth request is international diplomatic cooperation. So commit to diplomatic measures under the Genocide Convention and similar agreements, affirming the international community's condemnation of these violations. And the last request is immediate humanitarian aid access, prioritizing unrestricted humanitarian aid access to Tigray to address widespread starvation and deprivation. And the international community has both a moral and a legal duty to address the genocide in Tigray and to protect vulnerable minority groups, including the Irob and Kunama. A unified response that incorporates these recommendations provides a roadmap to justice and accountability, delivering essential support to victims who have suffered unimaginable horrors. This is a pivotal moment. Let us stand together in condemning these atrocities and ensure that Tigray receives the justice it deserves. So when you are using the link or when you go to OMNA and you sign the petition, as we've done in the past 3 years, you're going to write your name, first name, last name, phone number, email, and address as well. So we're pretty much professionals at this. Unfortunately, we've been doing this, but I just want to thank you all in advance for jumping back and continuing to fight. It's been a really, really long journey, but we didn't get this far only to get this far. So I'm really grateful for everybody that's still here, and make sure that you're sharing the petition as well. Let me know if you have issues or questions with the petition. That is all that I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunbright. With that, we move on to Meliti for the English panel discussion, and I'll be assisting her as well. Meliti, welcome.
Thank you, Danny Howie, and salam dak. Hi to everyone who's on this call. Thank you for being a part of this important conversation. 4 years since the war on Tigray began, 2 years since the Pretoria Agreement. We're exhausted, and I get it, but everyone is still working hard and is still fighting for justice, for peace, for our families, frankly. So thank you for staying in this fight. And really, it's a privilege to have this conversation when I think about where we were, 4 years ago in complete darkness in Tigray. And the fact that I know Ambassador Fisaha is on this call, I saw his name, the fact that we all became de facto ambassadors for Tigray, because who would speak? It was only us. And so I know we're tired. I'm speaking for myself as well and everyone here, but we didn't, as Samrawit said, we didn't come this far just to come this far. And so the fight continues. By conservative estimates, 600,000 Tigrayans were killed, but we know that journalists still don't have true access into Tigray. We know that number is much larger. I can tell you of 13 of my own family members who were killed in the genocide. So think about that, one family, 13 people. So we know that the number is much higher than what's being reported. We know that food insecurity which is just a fancy word for starvation. People are being starved to death, including right now. And this is urgent and important, and we're doing a terrible job of being able to protect Tigrayans in general, but especially the minority groups within Tigray, the Irob and the Kunama. I mean, it's a shame that it's almost like a side conversation instead of the most important conversation. And so, these are things that we have to talk about. And so I'm glad that we're here today. And I'm so grateful for Dr. Ibrahim for his notes. Some of it knocks the wind out of us just to hear that people still don't know. And we're like, what do you mean people don't know? I can recall with Tigray Action Committee being in the halls of, on Capitol Hill every day for a month and going office to office to office to office. But I think there's a bigger story there about why folks aren't being involved. I ran into Sam Gubru several times, actually, and I know his work and advocacy, and we're going to hear from him in just a second, is strong. And so I think there are additional interests or reasons why we're not making progress. And so to have someone who can help push us along is incredibly helpful. So without further ado, let me just give you a little brief bios of our panelists, and then we'll just jump right in and have a conversation, because really I could talk to each of these people for an hour, and we have an hour to speak to the four of them. So you've already been introduced to Dr. Ibrahim and his work as senior director with the New Lines Institute. That report that they compiled is so powerful and comprehensive and detailed and actionable with authority. I think that it's going to be a huge help. And that call that's coming up on November 9th, I hope to be a part of that. I know everyone here will want to be, so we can figure out how to better strategize. So thank you for that. Samuel Gubru is a Tigrayan American social entrepreneur, educator, and policy analyst with over 18 years of experience in political strategy and nonprofit leadership across the United States and East Africa. He's CEO of Black Line Strategies and a professor of the practice of political science at Tufts University. His accomplishments are numerous, but let me just say he was and is a northern light amidst the darkness with everything that was happening in Tigray. And so I'm so grateful that he's here to speak with us today. I also want to introduce Sara Siyum. She's the Deputy Director of the Irob Anina Civil Society. She's a Tigrayan American public health professional with a background in international relations and human rights. She spent the last 4 years since the start of the genocidal war on Tigray organizing and advocating for the people of Irob and Tigray at large. Irob still has no relief in spite of the cessation of hostilities and so-called forward movement in Tigray. So I'm so grateful that you're here to give more insight. And of course, Mahalet with our beloved Omna Tigray. Mahalet has been doing incredible work and specializes with refugee tracking, documentation, interviewing, as well as connecting the US community with refugees and refugee support, facilitating resettlement opportunities. The refugees is a whole nother story, especially those in Sudan who have largely been forgotten about. And not because we don't care, but again, because we were just so exhausted. And so this is a good moment to reinvigorate and bring back those very important conversations. So these are the four folks that I have the privilege to talking with right now. And so I'm just going to jump right in. And Danny, I know there's some questions that you have that you want to ask, so feel free to give me a smoke signal or something when you want to jump in here. But otherwise, I'm going to get right in. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start with Dr. Ibrahim. You said some pretty powerful things in terms of people not knowing about what's happening in Tigray. And so I'm curious to hear more, and specifically around how important is getting this recognition of genocide. We know that the State Department made a determination, and we know that they shelved it for for whatever reason, Sam Gabru can give us more on that because he's the expert on that. But tell us, how important is it to get this recognition of genocide in order, and is it a prerequisite to get justice for our families and address what happened appropriately?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. And the one thing we need to appreciate is that policymakers have quite a large turnover. Yeah, so when I went to the European Union, for example, the people that I met who are now in the key positions, they had literally just been appointed a week before. Yeah, so we actually waited. We launched our report, around the summer, but we waited till now because we wanted to see and meet with the people who had just been appointed to the various committees, the various kind of party political leadership, etc. So, and they're all basically brand new, and so they're not fully cognizant of what's going on. Like I said, most of them were quite aware of what's happening in Sudan and Darfur, but with Tigray, they genuinely had very kind of little knowledge. With all of these situations, you have to be able to present what's happening there in the interest of the policymakers that you're speaking to. So, for example, the priority of the European Union is quite frankly to stop migration, into Europe, stopping the illegal migration that's coming from all over the world, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's from Africa and so on. So the way we presented our report is that, look, what is happening in Tigray is leading to massive amounts of instability. And you may think that you are in the process of normalization with the Ethiopian government and other actors, but this is actually still going on. And this is going to lead to even more refugee flows, which Europe cannot absorb. So if you want to basically stop those flows over the long term, you need to look at a more comprehensive strategy. And so one of the things we did mention is that there's a European Union fund of 680 million euros that is going to Ethiopia. And what we wanted to do is add some, not necessarily stop this funding, because that would be far too big of an ask, but to essentially add some more conditions onto it. Yeah. And so once again, it comes back to my point, you have to be realistic in what you can achieve. You have to be very, very realistic. Yeah. So stopping, 680 million euros is not a realistic proposition for us. So we did speak to somebody who's the chief whip of one of the largest political parties, the political groupings in the European Union. And we asked him that, look, the Commission is brand new in Europe, and all we want to do is add some additional requirements. You can get $680 million, certainly, but here are the additional requirements that Ethiopia must meet. For example, access to journalists, access to healthcare, access to UN observers. These few simple items that are completely uncontroversial. So nobody in the European Commission would disagree, oh yes, we need to have access to journalists, open access to journalists. We need to have reporting mechanisms. So these are the kind of things you can just add on. Yeah. So the chief whip that we spoke to, he was very happy to say, so okay, he goes, look, there's a new commission and we'll basically just ask them to add these additional kind of requirements on. So it comes back to my point that, look, for Europe, the priority is essentially stopping votes. That's basically the number one priority in the European Union. Is after the war in Ukraine, is basically we need to stop migration flows. Europe cannot absorb these kind of numbers. And the argument we made was that, look, this is massive amounts of instability. And what you are doing by letting some of the key actors away with these genocidal acts is that not only are you encouraging them, but you're also emboldening other leaders to see that, look, this is how you take care of it. And one of the arguments I made very early on when I was working on the Rohingya genocide is that, if you allow one genocide to happen, all the evidence shows that you're just going to open the door to many others. And once these perpetrators are finished with one group, they'll just turn their attention onto other groups. You spoke about the Irob and the Kunama, etc. One by one, they'll just keep going until they're forced to stop. And in fact, forcing them to stop is actually, in many cases, is a lot easier than people anticipate. There is not a question of you need to send in troops, you need to send in the military. People have these grand kind of visions. Usually nodes of pressure can have a very effective, can be quite effective. Simply trying to identify what those nodes of pressure are. One other thing I would point out, and this is also very important to know, is that when I was meeting with officials from the United Nations, so these meetings were being set up by one of my very good friends, who's the retired Secretary General for Human Rights. So he was helping me set up the meetings, the different missions, ambassadors. Many of them refused to meet with me. Yeah, many of them refused to meet with me. Many of the major European countries, they refused to meet with me. Why? Because our report had the word genocide in the title. Genocide. And the United Nations missions do not want to deal with genocide at the moment, anything to do with genocide, because they know that the next question somebody's going to ask is, okay, there's a genocide in Tigray, we recognize that. What about Gaza? What are you doing about that? Why are you ignoring that? So they don't want to deal with Gaza, they don't want to deal with Tigray, and they don't want to deal with anything genocide related. His exact words were, and I quote you exactly, he said, they don't want to deal with anything to do with the G word. The G word, that's exactly what he said. So some of the major missions, in the UN, they just refuse to meet. So this is the other thing, and I will be speaking about this on November 9th in our calls, that you have to use a multi-pronged strategy on this. We have done the report, on the genocide, but now we have to kind of approach this from another angle. And this is why I'm looking into conflict-related sexual violence, looking at forced starvation, because this would open up a completely different audience of policymakers, completely different audience. Those many policymakers on the Hill, in Congress, in the UK, Europe, they don't want to deal with anything related to genocide. And this is not personally about Tigray, but nothing, whether it's Darfur, whether it's Rohingya, nothing to do with genocide, because they know they are stuck. And the next question is going to be, what the hell? Why are you basically not dealing with what's happening in the Middle East? The ICJ rulings, ICC rulings on Gaza. So they don't want to deal with it. So you focus on other issues, forced starvation, etc. So this will open up new policymakers and makes things easier for them. And also, especially the CRSV, opens up the sexual violence. Very different policymakers, some very powerful female senators will pick this up. It's changing. Obviously, we'll have a new leader soon. But even Jill Biden, one of my staff members, has been in touch with her office, the First Lady of the United States, and getting her to kind of champion this would have been the ideal kind of situation. So you have to have a multi-pronged strategy. Genocide is a very loaded word for many people now, many countries, but then focus on CRSV, focus on forced starvation, focus on children, focus on multiple strategy. You have to use multi-pronged strategy, and this is what we have to do now.
Wow, I have like a million follow-up questions, but I'm going to actually go to Sam Gabru. But I do want to say, Dr. Ibrahim, you said something really powerful. And I recall when Nima El-Bashir from CNN did the story about what was happening to women in Tigray is when we got traction, when we got a lot of traction at that time. And so you're kind of like connecting some dots too that I think.
Yeah, and just very quickly before you pass on, I'll point out as well, so our report on the Uyghur genocide, for example, was probably the most effective report that any think tank has done. I met with Secretary Pompeo, and the State Department lawyers made a determination on genocide based on our report. And I know this because I got it in writing from them. So which part of our report convinced the State Department lawyers that there is a genocide going on? It was actually one of the smallest parts of our report, which we didn't even pay too much attention to. And that was a forced sterilization of Uyghur women. The forced sterilization of Uyghur girls, which is a genocidal act in terms of preventing births of a group. That was a very narrow part. Which part, and the same thing in Ukraine, 13 parliaments, including the ICC, we were also in touch with the ICC and the ICJ. Which part of our report convinced them to issue a warrant against Putin? The ICC issued, and the bar for that is very high. It was basically, once again, a very small part of the report, which was the forcible transfer of children in Russia. The reason they were able to do that is because they had an online telephone. Putin had an online telephone showing that, look, these are Ukrainian children and we're going to give them out to Russian families. Very small part of the report. So, you and I and everybody else is very heavily focused on the killing, and it's absolutely catastrophic what is happening, no doubt. But that is not necessarily what's going to push this issue over the line. So we have to have a multi-pronged strategy. And the reality is, all of our reports focus on genocide, but the reality is that is not always the best, and that is not the only way to kind of pursue this. And it's becoming increasingly, day by day, even more loaded and even more difficult to kind of push genocide questions. And, countries literally refused to meet with me. And even though the meetings were set up, they cancelled. Major European countries said, look, we don't want to have anything to do with the G word.
Wow, that's actually really important intel. Sam, I'm going to bring you into the conversation because I know you've done a lot on Capitol Hill and you've made, you have lots of relationships. Can you talk a little bit about that political will that didn't seem to be there and what we missed maybe in our advocacy and where we should be focusing? But also, can you bring in the Pretoria Agreement? I think when it first came out, there was a lot of devastation. It felt like a big loss, but I think there was a missed maybe, I don't know if opportunity is the right word, but maybe we weren't viewing it in the right light because we had those unrealistic expectations that Dr. Ibrahim was talking about. But what did we miss that we could have used or maybe can still use to our advantage with the Pretoria Agreement? If you can weave that into, I know those are like two different things, but there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. And happy Sunday to everyone. I just want to co-sign everything that Dr. Azim said. I think, the reality is a lot of us get hung up on the G word. And while, we may think that what happened in Tigray was a genocide, that's I would argue that's not the hill that we should die on. There are other things that can and should happen in the meantime. And, I do want to echo, as everyone knows, in March 2023, right before he went to Ethiopia, the U.S. Secretary of State did release the State Department's atrocity determination. The determination said that war crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing had occurred. And this is also in line with reports that the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and even the Ethiopia Human Rights Commission had put out. And so, we saw a lot of traction in the past 2 years of recognizing that serious atrocities occurred in Tigray. That's a lot of ground to act on. Like, we have a lot of information. We have a body of work that we can leverage already without the actual genocide label. And so that's one thing I definitely want to uplift from what Dr. Ibrahim said. So on the Pretoria side, and just on the larger sort of U.S. foreign policy and Western approach to Ethiopia, the big thing that I think people should remember is, for the West, Ethiopia is too big to fail. That's just the reality. Ethiopia is too big to fail. It is the historic anchor of stability in the Horn of Africa. And so for Western policymakers, the past 4 years in Ethiopia, and really the past 8 years plus in Ethiopia, have been extremely concerning to them. But I would argue, and I've said this to many of them, that they have a very short-term view when they think of Ethiopia. This idea that stability can come only through Abiy, for instance, is absurd. And we're seeing that the country not only is unstable internally, but it has become an exporter of instability in the Horn of Africa and in the larger Red Sea region. And so, that argument itself nullifies their thinking. But the big devastating thing that happened this past summer was that the State Department determined, had an assessment that there was no longer a pattern of gross human rights abuses occurring in Ethiopia. And that's a pretty big assessment, because that assessment is what led to the U.S. voting in favor of World Bank support for Ethiopia and International Monetary Fund support for Ethiopia. And this is, the IMF funding in particular is the whale that Abiy was looking for these past 2-3 years. I think it's no secret to everyone on this call, the Ethiopian economy is in shambles. Forget Tigray's economy, the entire country's economy is in shambles right now, and it desperately needed the IMF and World Bank support. Yes, there were some preconditions that were placed on it, which is good. The question, still remains: will these preconditions actually be met? Will there be actual monitoring and verification? And will there be consequences if these preconditions are not met? I don't hold too much hope for these sorts of things, but this is another body of work that we can lean on and say, well, hey, look, you guys released this money to Ethiopia with certain preconditions, and these preconditions are not being met, whether it's regarding good governance or certain economic reforms. That gives us a certain ammunition, if you will, a certain talking point to say, back to U.S. policymakers or European policymakers, what you're doing is inappropriate or incorrect, and here are the reasons why. When it comes to the Pretoria Agreement, it is a net positive. It's a good thing. I think a lot of people in November 2022 were upset, but the reality is, wars end, and all wars have to end at some point. And this was a good end to the war in Tigray. Frankly, people were suffering, to your point, by conservative estimates. 600,000 people died. We know the number is more, 800 to 1 million, maybe even more. But suffice to say, about 20% of Tigrayans died, whether it was through bullets or through starvation. People are gone. And because of that, there are some enormous needs that need to be addressed in Tigray. War needs to stop. The Pretoria Agreement provides a good framework for stopping the war. The problem is it hasn't been implemented. That's the issue. And so when we think about, for instance, the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of Tigrayan fighters, a lot of these fighters are ordinary people. These are people who had ordinary lives before the war began. Many of these people are, university educated. They went about their normal lives and picked up arms because that's what you had to do to survive. And they need to return to their normal lives, but there isn't a lot of hope for them. One of the big concerns that I have right now is this brain drain that we're seeing from Tigray. Very skilled young people who are extremely hopeless. And those who are in Tigray are hopeless, but then there are many who are leaving Tigray, going to other parts of Ethiopia, or who are making the dangerous trek to head to Yemen or wherever else. The very fact that Yemen is an appealing place for Tigrayans right now speaks to the level of desperation that's in Tigray. And so I think that's a big issue. When we think about the provision of the Pretoria Agreement that looks at respecting international boundaries and internal boundaries, the reality of the matter is Eritrean troops are still in Tigray. That violates the Pretoria Agreement because they're within the Ethiopian international boundary borders. And so Eritrean troops have not withdrawn. We know Amhara troops have not withdrawn. We know that displaced people have not returned to their homes. There has been some returning of IDPs, which is a good thing, but by far and large, internally displaced people have not been returned. The Tigrayan refugees in Sudan, we have forgotten about. Not we, but the world has forgotten about. And how tragic is it that they have left one war only to find themselves in the midst of another war? So the other issue here that we're looking at is when it comes to monitoring and verification and compliance of the Pretoria Agreement. The reality is that the structures that were set up in the agreement are not actually working, whether it's the AU's monitoring and verification mechanism, or whether it's the international partners, including the US and others. They're just not meeting. They're not engaging in an appropriate way. They're not having their regularly scheduled compliance meetings. In the past 2 years, they've only held two. There have only been two review meetings for the cessation of hostilities agreement, and that has been another area where there needs to be significant pressure on our part, that they need to actually be meeting, they need to be assessing what's going on the ground, and we need to have more monitors on the ground. The last thing I will say is when it comes to the peace process and the political process, and this was referenced earlier by, I believe, Dr. Teka in his remarks, there is indeed a leadership crisis in Tigray. The post-conflict challenges that Tigray faces, it requires a different type of leadership. It requires wise and patient leadership. It requires leadership that is transparent and accountable to its people. We're not seeing that right now among Tigray's political actors, and that is deeply devastating, not just to people in Tigray, but to those in the diaspora who have went above and beyond to advocate for Tigray and the people of Tigray these past few years. And so there needs to be more focus on our part done to put pressure on Tigrayan leaders to, quite frankly, get their act together and realize that this period, this Pretoria Agreement period that Tigray is in, is as challenging as active conflict, if not more. Rebuilding the region is going to require enormous fortitude and enormous leadership that we, quite frankly, at the moment are lacking. Transitional justice and accountability. The question that I am asking people lately is, are we truly ready for transitional justice and accountability? And this is a dicey one because everybody wants justice and accountability, but we want it for the other person. And so are we ready? Are we ready for actual conversations, actual processes to occur? And part of the challenge here is we all know the Ethiopian government, and this is true of successive governments, but Abiy's government is very stubborn and does not want to be told what to do by the international community. And so there's this national-led process for transitional justice and for national dialogue, neither of which are credible, neither of which are sustainable or inclusive. And we're seeing that there isn't really any confidence within the country for these processes. And so that's something that I'm definitely concerned about. Is transitional justice. I think in the meantime, what we should be focusing on is documentation, preservation of evidence. Insofar as that can occur, that is important because the preservation of evidence, whether it is physical evidence or interviewing with survivors, this body of work can be used for future transitional justice purposes, whether these are national level processes or if there's an African-led process at some point, AU-led or some sort of regional tribunal, it can open the door for future things. But I think in the meantime, preserving evidence is important. And then the last two things, one is just there's still a unremained answer for the status of Tigray within the federal framework in Ethiopia. Tigray still doesn't have its representatives in the Ethiopian parliament, and also there are still budgetary transfer issues. Civil servants in Tigray have not been paid. Pensioners who've vested their pension over decades in Ethiopia's pension system have not received pension these past 4 years. And so there's still a lot of questions around what is the state of Tigray within the federal framework. And then lastly, the mental health and psychosocial piece is extremely important. The reality is that there are a lot of hidden impacts in war, and there is funding available for certain things, whether it's disarmament and demobilization and reintegration, or whether it's for humanitarian aid. But there isn't a lot of support that's being invested right now when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support. And yes, this is for survivors of sexual violence, but it's for all of the survivors, all of the genocide survivors. And so if we don't invest in Tigray's mental well-being and frankly in the diaspora's well-being, I think that that's going to have significant impacts as we think about what does post-conflict Tigray look like.
Wow. I'm not going to ask any follow-up because I do have them, but I want to bring Sara and Mahalet into the conversation as well. But two things about what you said. You said Ethiopia is stubborn, but yet they're aid dependent. And so how do we, make those two things sort of work in our favor, which I think is what Dr. Ibrahim was getting to earlier. And we know helped a little bit amidst the genocide as well, but it seemed like they were willing to reverse that. Governments were willing to reverse that pretty easily before there was real evidence of transformation on the ground. And the other thing is around justice. How will the Ethiopian government hold itself accountable? I don't think it doesn't seem possible. And so maybe justice is a bit further out than we know. And so you get into that whole, how do we document things then? And later I want to ask Dr. Ibrahim about your interview processes and the things you were doing and how you were capturing stories and evidence to be used later, because I think that might be an area that now that we do have access to Tigray, maybe because journalists can't get in still, but maybe there's a way that the diaspora can do more work in that area that's effective, where we're not, maybe destroying evidence inadvertently, where we're actually being able to capture and get things into the right hands. But Sara, I want to bring you in because it really is just a stain, the fact that we have not been able to protect, our minority ethnic groups within Tigray. And so I want to hear a little bit about, since the cessation of hostilities agreement, what steps do you think have been taken by the relevant parties to protect minorities and ensure their participation in the peace and reconciliation process, which I would argue is tough because I'm not sure that we have one going at this point, but the attempt at it anyways. And how are these steps addressing the ongoing challenges like forced disappearances, sexual violence on these impacted communities?
Yeah, thanks so much, Melati. And thanks for having me on this panel. I really want to start with saying that the Irob and Kunama are part of Tigray and they are Tigrayans. So they're not an addendum, they are part of it. And as the genocide was conducted, it was conducted against Tigrayans, which included the Irob and Kunama. So when Eritrean forces came in, they weren't thinking, oh, you're Irob, we're not going to target you because you're not Tigray. They were considered Tigrayan. The language that was used during the genocidal rape was language like Wayane. It was very clearly that they were part of the in-group against which the genocide was committed. So I just want to start with that. But yes, as we've talked about, violations are ongoing. And we have ongoing occupations, both in Western Tigray and then on border communities, including, land inhabited by the Irob and the Kunama people. I'm going to speak specifically towards about the Irob people. I mean, 60% of our land is still occupied, if we look at in terms of districts, and by Eritrean forces. And this occupation is a brutal occupation, as it has been since the start of the genocidal war on November 2020. And just for historical context, this was not the first time that the Irob were subjected to these atrocity crimes. We're talking about, 1998 to 2000 border war, for which there was no justice and accountability. Same playbook was unleashed. Conflict-related sexual violence that was systematic, extrajudicial killings, destruction of agriculture. All of the tactics that were used at that time were employed since November 2020 in Irob and then through the rest of Tigray. So we really, in this case, we thought with the cessation of hostilities agreement, with the condition that non-ENDF forces and forward forces would have to leave Tigray, we thought, okay, maybe there is hope. But what we've seen actually is no change at all, as you mentioned. It's ongoing occupation. We still have, lots of cases of sexual violence being reported daily. And this is not at the health centers in Irob district, because there's no access to care there. They have to, take arduous trips to Adigrat to try to access care. It's very, very difficult conditions. So the COHA the cessation of hostility agreement has not stopped anything. There are no mechanisms in place. There's no protection for the people there. The ENDF forces that were stationed sort of nearby left recently, like there's no protection from the Ethiopian side. And so even in the unoccupied areas of Irob, there's a constant threat of reinvasion, and they're living under the, terror of the potential for Eritreans to just come in the next day, which is a possibility. So there is no normalcy. And in a lot of ways, the war for the Irob is not over. It ended for some in November, on November 2nd, 2022. It did not end for the people of Irob. And this is something that is excluded out of the narrative. It's something that we've had a hard time as a community, the way we talk about the war as it's active. Yes, the active cessations between the TDF and the ENDF have ceased, but for the Irob, who have historically been overlooked, not just by the federal government, but equally by our regional government, and even today by the interim administration, who almost never cites Irob, even when mentioning Western Tigray still under occupation. Very little, if anything, is said about the border areas in Tigray, including the Irob, right? It's not just Irob that's occupied. There are other areas that are sovereign Ethiopian territory, which remain occupied today. And in a lot of ways, Abiy Ahmed has kind of decided that he's willing to cede that Ethiopian sovereignty. There is very little to indicate that's going to be, those areas are going to be protected and kept within Ethiopia, which is what we're fighting for, right? We want to free Tigray. We're part of Tigray. We have been part of Tigray since we have existed as an indigenous minority group on that land. So there really aren't, the mechanisms there. So it's a very, very precarious situation, which we as a community, Tigrayan and non-Tigrayan, have to keep advocating for an end to the ongoing atrocity crimes and violence. And not to mention, I didn't even speak about the humanitarian conditions, but I can mention that in further questions. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. My mother's family's from Rama, also close to the border. And they currently are in Axum because there's still Eritrean soldiers in Rama. And so they can't go back. It's not safe. And obviously there's some people who do go back. So I empathize deeply with what you're sharing. So in your opinion, how inclusive have the reporting mechanisms been toward these groups? I mean, I think you've already touched on that in terms of they're not included. We're not hearing about what's happening in Europe. And if we are, it's just not very much. So what can we do? How can we do better? I mean, how are you guys accessing information and just what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think this is something that's very important. I mean, we were very lucky with ICRI, with the, International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, when they had their mandate until last year. They were engaged and they were very aware of Europe, and they included that in their investigation as part of the broader atrocity crimes that have been committed since November 3rd, 2020. And that's something that since then has kind of, we want to make sure that keeps going. We don't want the Europe to be excluded of justice and accountability pathways. And this is what we're very afraid of, even though we were very thankful that as a Tigrayan community for the New Lines report, and we thought it's very important, the first report, to speak to the intent of the genocide, which was really big for our community, that this recognition from others besides ourselves came. For us, it was great, but it was also sad and a bit disappointing, just because as a ethnic group, as a people that's always excluded out of, what it is, whether it's in Ethiopia or in Tigray, the fact that suffering wasn't acknowledged was difficult, right? And so we want to make sure that we find ways to keep doing this. And there are ways that we can, but we don't want it to be, now that we have this recognition and we want to fight for recognition and genocide determination, it has to include these minorities, because they were not second or third in the list in terms of where they're bordering Eritrea. The troops came in, they came through those bordering areas. So they were a main pillar of the genocide in Tigray, is what has happened to these minorities who we currently face an existential threat, right? We're numbers between 35,000 to 45,000, or a little more if more recent estimates are taken into account. And this is a population that's mostly displaced now. Most of this population is internally displaced, either in Adigrat or in neighboring countries. And we, as all Tigrayans, and especially the Europe, our connection to our land is paramount, and we're displaced from it. But, sorry, going back to the documentation, there are ways. So Banina has worked with victim groups and is trying to find pathways and document what has happened, and for the victims and survivors themselves to advocate for themselves and find ways. But it's mostly, and we're working with other organizations as well that are non-Tigrayan who are helping support these victim groups. But for the most part, it's mostly like symbolic, because there's no real framework where we're able to say, okay, now that you've shared this, like with ICRI, there was like something that they were sharing it, and they knew that it would be reported, and that would be reported on the international stage. And we don't have that mechanism because they got rid of it. And so because of that, it's hard to have a point to a lot of what they're doing, but it's so important. The documentation, whether it's today or in 10 years, 15 years, however long it takes us to get it, if we document everything accordingly today, it'll make a huge difference. And I think we have to make sure that even the current crimes still committed today in Europe and in occupied areas are documented appropriately. And it's hard because some of these areas are hard to reach, but we have ways. Even at the height of the war, we had ways to try to get some information through different, mechanisms that we had. It was still very hard, especially during the telecommunications blockade, where we didn't have much of anything. People would have to go to certain mountaintops and travel to certain parts of, little mountaintops where they might get one bar to be able to report that this many people died, right? But today, where we have a bit more access, especially in unoccupied areas, we have to make sure that we're documenting it and in an inclusive way that includes the Irob and the Kunama.
On that note, I'm going to go to Mahalet because you're talking about displaced people, and then we have this whole story with refugees. But just one quick thing, Sara, when I went to Sudan when the war first broke, so 2021, that first quarter, I went to Sudan with Tigray Media House, and I met someone from Irob, and they had lists of people who were killed in that initial, when the war first began. And I'm sure you have all of those kinds of connections, but you're right. And we need a way to kind of like gather all of that so that it's all in the same box instead of these different like silos or whatever. But Mahalet, with Omna Tigray, I want to bring you into the conversation because, and Sam mentioned this as well with the refugees in Sudan, as we know that people poured over the border initially until the border was blocked, which in and of itself is a war crime to block the border, but that's what happened. And so, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who need help, not just in Sudan, but in other parts. So can you talk a little bit about the refugee situation? Where are people now? Are you hearing anything from Sudan? I know there's a story in South Sudan as well. And what kind of work are you guys doing right now to help these refugees who also have become sort of a side story now and hoping that somebody remembers what's going on there?
Melita, let me add just a couple of things to Mahalet as well. I'm so grateful for this panel. You guys are amazing. So Sam mentioned the displaced people, IDPs in Tigray, as well as refugees. So Mahalet, if you can really add, if I can add to my Melita's questions, what are the most urgent needs Tigrayan refugees currently have, and then where is the support needed? And then if you can also talk a little bit about what we can do here in the U.S. in terms of U.S. residents, citizens, what we can do to help, what are the requirements and commitments? If you can just touch up on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Danny and Melita, for having me. To touch on some of the questions that Melita you had regarding what's happening with Tagada refugees, especially in Sudan. Unfortunately, as we all know, like the Tagada refugees in Sudan are now in a second wave of war that they're facing in Sudan. What we're currently seeing is Tagada refugees from Sudan are now trying to flee to neighboring countries. So we're seeing Tagada refugees in Sudan fleeing to Egypt right now, trying to get to Cairo for safety. Unfortunately, that route to Egypt has a lot of smugglers, kidnapping, hostage situations that happen where they get held and they call for ransom for family members in Ethiopia or other places, when we all know these are refugees whose family have become IDPs or who don't have resources. So they end up in these predicaments that are a danger to their life. And, unfortunately, some of them get held for months or even however long that they might have to be in those circumstances before they get to safety in another country that they're trying to reach. So we're seeing that happen. The refugees arriving in Egypt, the majority of them that find a way to make it there from Sudan are becoming homeless. So there's not really camps that they can live in, similar to where they were in Tanadba and other areas in Sudan. So they're living in the streets of Egypt, homeless, not having access to food and resources. The UN, UNHCR in Egypt is backed up because there's hundreds of thousands of Sudanese refugees that are now in Egypt because of, the war in Sudan, and now getting documentation and resources and food assistance from the UN takes months, if not almost close to a year, for a new refugee that's now arriving from Sudan, because they have to get re-registered. They have to go through the whole process again in Egypt because their registration from UNHCR Sudan is not valid in Egypt. So we're seeing that happening. And then the other refugees that we're seeing fleeing from Sudan are fleeing to Libya and other similar areas where they're being kidnapped in Libya and sold for, as we all know, human slavery. And we're seeing Tagada refugees, over 2,000 of them currently in Libya, who are being held by kidnappers. And they're asking for ransoms up to 6,000 per refugee that's there. That's 2,000 refugees at minimum that we have in Libya right now being held by kidnappers that we can't free. they're going to be working for them for free labor or whatever it might be for probably the rest of their lives, unless we can work together or the international community can intervene to help those refugees that are there. But outside of those Sudanese refugees, that's the Tigray refugees that are escaping from Sudan, I mean, we have refugees that are in Kenya and Uganda and Djibouti. In Djibouti, we have over 500 of them. In Kenya, there's at least over 100, and in Uganda, there's a few thousand that, we're aware of. So the work that we do is usually going to camps, documenting them, tracking their testimonies, identifying like what happened to them, how did they get there, and then, making sure at least we have a record of their experience and how they arrived in that circumstance and situation. And then as a part of that, we get to know who these refugees are and identify like what's their story, what dates did they come, and see what are ways we can help them in terms of getting resettlement, if any, based off of like private group sponsorships, for example, in the US or Canada or other ways. There's a few refugees we've been able to work with in that type of circumstance. So in this situation, I know Danny, you mentioned what's happening with South Sudan. There's 70 Tagaro peacekeepers in South Sudan who are refugees who do qualify under some resettlement programs. So we are working on those initiatives. So right now we do have a project with TDA and OMNA where we've allocated about $170,000 to this effort from TDA. So grateful to them for this effort and for the funding they're providing, but it allows us in the US here who can form groups of 5 within the Welcome Corps process to identify the Tagaro peacekeepers. Working with OMNA, you can work with us to identify who they, their situation and who qualifies under the guidelines, and work together to actually, apply for them and sponsor them if they get the opportunity to resettle through that program. It would be one way that we can help the peacekeepers in South Sudan. So some of the requirements, as Danny was asking, are, green card holders, permanent residents, or US citizens within the US can form a group of 5 in their community, use TDA as their financial backer because they require at least 2,425 or so per refugee. TDAs will provide you the financial statements, letters that you need. When the refugees come, they'll pay for the housing and all expenses that'll be covered. And then you as a resident, a permanent resident or a green card holder or citizen can form that group with your community, with your family members, anyone that's over 18, as long as they don't have a criminal background and can pass a background check. You can apply for these refugees and help them resettle into your community. I know we talked about the refugees in Sudan. Unfortunately, they don't qualify. So when we're talking about refugees, we're talking about those in Kenya, Djibouti, South Sudan, refugees that are in qualifying countries. They can't be in a country that's in active war. Sudan doesn't qualify for this program because they are in a war. The US government can interview them there and vet if they're really a refugee and help them with the resettlement process. But at least we know those in South Sudan, Djibouti, Kenya, and other areas qualify. Other questions people usually have is I have a family member that's a refugee. They made it to Egypt. Can I now apply for them because they were registered in South and Sudan? One of the key requirements for this is your family member has to have been registered, or the refugee you're trying to help get resettled has to have been registered before September 30, 2023. So when you're a refugee in Sudan and you went to Egypt and you're re-registered, you're re-registering after that date of September 30, 2023. Unless they arrived before that. Their ID cards have to show that they registered in Egypt before that date, and their Sudan registration doesn't count because now you're under the jurisdiction of Egypt and the Egyptian UNHCR. So unfortunately, majority of the refugees that are fleeing from Sudan to Egypt, we can't help them because of some of these limitations. But the refugees that did arrive prior to that and have evidence from UN to document that they have that, we can help. And then, as I've said, the refugees in South Sudan, we have the 70, we have the funding to help them. All you have to do is contact us. You can message us at Help Tigray or contact@omnatigray.org, and then we'll definitely be able to work with you on it. I'll drop some of the emails in the chat as well, but this is currently the circumstances. And I guess I can also dive into some of the issues in the camp itself. The refugees in Kenya, Djibouti, South Sudan, they're not receiving enough food assistance. We're seeing, a lot of issues with malaria, illnesses that they're facing. A lot of the women that are in the area are attacked and re-victimized in the camp. So it might be a rape survivor from Tigray who made it there, and they're re-victimized in the camp as well. So there's a lot of medical needs as well, in addition to psychological and trauma that they're going through. So That's pretty much what's happening right now and the ways that we as US residents or citizens can support.
Wow. Thank you, Mahalet. It's easy to do. They just need to get in touch with Omna Tigray, and I'm in one of those groups. Like everyone should be in one of those groups. That's a direct call to action. You know, it's something you can share with your neighbors and friends too. All along, people always say, "Well, how do we help you?" You know, when we tell our story, and this is an easy way. So hopefully, everyone on this call should reach out to Omna Tigray and get on that list to sponsor a refugee to come here. There's literally very little obligation other than showing them around when they get there, acclimating them to the new cities or whatever. The funding is taken care of through TDA and through OMNA's partnership. So thank you for that work. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then I just want to give everyone a chance to for a minute or so to kind of wrap up any thoughts you have, or if I didn't ask a question that you really want to share, to make sure you're able to do that. But my question, first of all, is around how do we preserve evidence? How should we be asking questions? How do we, it seems like an easy area for the diaspora to play a role, perhaps, if we can't get ultimately what we want, like asking, you know, the low-hanging fruit, I guess, as Dr. Ibrahim was talking about earlier. So maybe he can take this question around what should we in the diaspora be doing as we do go back to Tigray, because now we are able to, most of us are able to go back, and what should we be doing? How were you able to capture a lot of these stories and evidence, and what's important for us to know? And maybe you can expand on this in the meeting on November 9th, or I can't remember the date, but you can expand on it more during that conversation. But what kinds of things can we be thinking about? Because I know when people come back from back home, they send me like Google Drives of videos and these things, and I'm like, I have no idea what to do with that other than, you know, trying to make connections, but there's probably a better way to do this. So would love to hear about how you capture evidence, what evidence you are capturing, how do you protect survivors, and how can we participate in that?
Melody, if I may just add one, I think for Dr. Ibrahim as well, that they can answer together. Professor Azim, you said earlier that it's crucial to keep the interest of Tigray alive, and we can't let this moment die out. So would it be easier and would our efforts be successful if we pursue accountability with most obvious criminals such as Daniel Kibret, as mentioned in the report? So if you can just elaborate on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Or even Niamin Zaleka, whatever his name is, he's here in Virginia or something, and he's part of ESAT Radio. I'm like, what can we do around this? There has to be something. So that's great add-on. Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer the question, the first one, in terms of preservation of evidence. So the way I would answer this is that, what is the purpose of the preservation of evidence, of collecting this information? If the purpose is to document historically what happened to the Tigrayan and other communities, then I think that's a very different kind of process and very different kind of requirement. And that's also very, very important. The reason why it's important is because in almost every one of these situations, after the fact, may not be tomorrow and may not be in 10 years, but there will be an effort of what they call historical engineering. We kind of rewrite the history of what actually happened. And we've seen this in almost every genocide that's happened, is that there's a bit of history rewriting where the architects of the genocide will try to figure out ways in which to absolve themselves from historical record. Just to give you one very quick example of this, I was in Bosnia recently where they had the Srebrenica massacre. So the manner in which the Serbian government has managed to kind of change the history of the Srebrenica massacre is not that they deny it. They don't say that, look, oh, this never happened, this is a lie, this is all fabricated. What they say, yes, it happened, but this was not our policy. This was a rogue police chief who undertook this massacre. Yeah, and he did it on his own. It was very terrible what happened, and it's very sad, and we totally regret it. But it wasn't our policy. So it's a very sophisticated historical engineering to blame one, acknowledge it happened, but this was a rogue police chief. So you will see the same thing happening in Tigray as well. But powers that be will try to absolve themselves. So to have an archive and have a mechanism by which you preserve all of this data And what I would suggest is that what the Tigrayan community should do is try to host this archive at an independent academic institution. So other communities have done this. So they'll have the Tigrayan archive at, for example, X university in University College London, in Georgetown, or wherever it may be. But it's an independent archive that has a historical record that's open, accessible, searchable, with all the videos and testimonials and everything else. That's the first thing. The second thing about the historical collecting the evidence, if you are looking for evidence to be used for prosecutorial purposes, for the ICC, the ICJ, or anything of that nature, then it's a very different process. It's a very different process. For that, you will need legal experts to collect this evidence, to preserve this evidence, and essentially how that evidence is also transmitted. What happens in what you put in the archive, what appears in the newspaper, is almost of no consequence at all for the legal process. And once again, to give you an example so you can understand this, if a newspaper report appeared, no matter how credible it is, no matter how credible the institution is, if a newspaper report appeared that Azim Ibrahim had murdered somebody on this, 2 weeks ago at a club somewhere, a judge will not read that newspaper report and say, look, Azim Ibrahim is a murderer, I'm sentencing him to prison. They will have their own process. How is this evidence collected? Where is the DNA? Where are the witnesses? How was this evidence transmitted? Has it been tampered with? Has it been interfered with? So that legal process is completely different from what journalists may write about, what the archive may say, which videos you may have. Judges will not take that into consideration. A court will not take that into consideration. And I know this because we had a similar issue with the Rohingya, the genocide. We had extensive amounts of information and videos, that appeared on CNN and so on, but they're all discarded by the ICJ because it is not the same process. And the example I gave you of a judge reading a newspaper is probably the easiest to understand. No matter what appears in the media, judges, the juries do not make their decisions on that. They make decisions on the evidence that's presented to the court, and that evidence is cross-examined. How it was collected, how it was tampered with, etc. So if you want to have evidence, to preserve evidence for a prosecutorial kind of level, then that is a very different process. For that, you would have to have lawyers involved. It has to be officially kind of collected, testimonials preserved, how they were preserved, etc. Very different process. But both of these are still very important to have the archives hosted at a credible academic institution or affiliated with an credible institution. So that's also been done with the Uyghurs, for example. They've done this, and they did this quite effectively to preserve the historical record and to preserve the memories of the victims, that they are not forgotten of what happened to them. Also very, very important. And then at the same time, having a mechanism by which you collect evidence that is then suitable and can be submitted to a court of law. And I've been through this process before, with some other communities, and literally the entirety of the archive, the entirety of the evidence is discarded. The court does not look at it at all because this is not evidence that they collected, and it could be tampered with, could be fake, could be anything, it could be out of context. So that's very important. And the second question, I think, in terms of sorry, what was the second question?
Around low-hanging fruit. We have people who are, like, for example, here in the diaspora, who were very much a part of inciting violence, for example. What could we be doing to hold these people accountable? Yeah, so we've had this situation also in Rwanda and elsewhere where people that were responsible for inciting violence have now been integrated back into the communities in Belgium and France, etc. Once again, I think getting some sort of legal kind of expert advice on this as to identifying those people and exposing them, I think it will remove the impunity that may go along with it. And it sends a strong message to those that are still carrying out these crimes, that look, you will not get away. Even if you target one individual, you manage to prosecute one individual, and there are obviously universal jurisdiction. There are countries that will do this very effectively.
Belgium and France and Spain. Argentina is doing one, for example, in the Rohingya case right now, using universal jurisdiction to target those individuals that have essentially gotten away. Some of them are maybe living in the West, and others are still inciting genocidal rhetoric against the Tigrayan community and others. It will send a very strong message that you cannot get away with this, no matter where you are, and that'll be very effective. But for that, you probably need to get some lawyers, legal experts, kind of involved to kind of do that process. Because one thing you don't want to do is to target people, and then it turns out that they weren't actually involved, or the cases collapse. Yeah, and then that sends the opposite message that the Tigrayan community is unable to pull this off. So for that, I think you have to be very careful as well.
Absolutely. Okay. One more question for Sam, and then we'll come around. We'll start with Mahalet and kind of reverse order, and just to give your final thoughts. But Sam, what should we be focusing on in terms of from a political landscape in the diaspora? I think a lot of us really are looking for direction. So you've said already the Pretoria Agreement hasn't been enforced. There are very obvious points that haven't been followed, like, what should we in the diaspora be focusing on right now? We know that fighting for genocide determination is one thing, but that's probably, we shouldn't lead with it. So what should we be doing right now to have effective conversations with our lawmakers and potentially getting justice?
Yeah, thank you. So I definitely agree with everything that Dr. Azim said, especially on the point of universal jurisdiction, which is something that Tigrayans have not actually done yet. But I think it'd be interesting to look at cases, whether it's in Germany or Belgium, Spain, Canada, etc. Even here in the US, where we do have universal jurisdiction, if we worked with international law firms that specialize in this, there may be certain cases. There's a high burden of evidence that you have to prove, as you said, but that's something interesting. The other thing is also, and this goes to the political piece, the last session of Congress, as everyone knows, there was legislation that we were all advocating for that was going to, hopefully, bring some sort of accountability to what was going on in Tigray. Obviously, the bills did not pass in either the House of Representatives or in the Senate, but one of the sections, one of the provisions, if you recall, Militi, in the Senate bill, actually would have gone after certain people in the diaspora for their role in inciting violence and human rights atrocities in Tigray and throughout Ethiopia. And the thinking behind that was, as many of us know, a lot of these diaspora actors don't act alone. Some of it is tied to Russia, some of it is tied to Iran, some of it is tied to Syria and elsewhere. And so there are malign foreign influence actors that are part of this, and so it would have gone after some of this as well. And I think that there still is a lot of interest in this in the U.S. Congress, in this particular piece of targeting these malign foreign countries that are teaming up with the Ethiopian diaspora in the United States to fuel human rights atrocities in Ethiopia. And so I think to the extent that that could be explored politically in the next session of Congress, which begins in January, I think that would be something, as people talk to their legislators, as you talk to members of Congress, as you talk to their staff, this could be one of the things that you bring up is just the role of certain people in the Ethiopian diaspora and their ties to these countries. The other things to note, I think, as everyone knows, in the United States, we have a presidential election coming up on Tuesday. This is going to be consequential for a lot of reasons, foreign and domestic. On the foreign side, particularly with Tigray and the Horn of Africa, this election will have consequences. In general, U.S. policy on Africa is bipartisan. So in general, that's a good thing. But what we have seen, obviously, with the Trump presidency last time around was this disregard for Africa. I think, many of you know certain comments that the former president made with regards to Africa that were not appealing. And so when we think about a Trump second-term administration's approach to human rights in Africa and approach to the geopolitics of the Horn of Africa, I don't think that serves in Tigray's best interests or in Ethiopia's in the people of Ethiopia's best interests. And so, in the short term, I do encourage everyone to get involved in this election. It is very important for a lot of reasons that but especially on the Tigray side of things. Donald Trump is not a friend to Tigray. This isn't to say that Kamala Harris will be Tigray's best friend either, but I do believe that a Harris administration would have a stronger interest in human rights in Tigray and in Ethiopia than a Trump administration would. And we would have a better chance of engaging with a Harris administration than we would with a Trump administration. So that's part of it on the political aspect of the role that Tigrayan Americans in particular can play for Tuesday. And the other thing to note as well is, the awareness raising, the pressure building. This is really important. Sarah mentioned earlier, the issues around the Pretoria Agreement and people sort of thinking, okay, well, great, everything is okay now in Tigray and we can move on, and how that has impacted in particular the Yoruba and Kunama people. But in general for Tigray, as everyone knows, once the Tigrayan and Ethiopian leaders shook hands in Pretoria, the world moved on. And that's typically how these peace processes work. They shook hands, we can move on, we can go to the next conflict. A few months after the Pretoria Agreement, Nigeria was having its election, so everybody turned their attention to Nigeria. And then, Sudan happened, and then, this and that. And so there's always something else that catches our attention, of course. And so, I do believe the Africa specialists in some of these foreign capitals do know what's going on, but we have to raise the level of consciousness, because it can't just be the same people. If you're just talking to people who are on, the U.S. House of Representatives Africa Subcommittee, that's nice, but you have to talk to everyone, and this is, part of the political process is constantly informing people of what's going on. And this is true in whichever country you live in, no matter, your governmental structure. Members of Congress, members of Parliament need to continuously be updated about what's happening in Tigray and throughout Ethiopia. And to reiterate, the point of what Dr. Azim said, Dr. Ibrahim said, because I firmly believe in this, and this is, what I do in my daily work as a lobbyist as well, is you have to tell people what's going on and why it matters from their point of view, from their interest. It can't be, oh, my people are dying, help. Yes, that's important, but what your talking point has to be is how Abiy is a threat to not just Ethiopia's long-term stability and security, but also, is not going to be someone who's advancing U.S. interests in Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa. If the United States is interested in a stable Ethiopia that is peaceful, that is secure, that is at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors, that is democratic, that is inclusive, that has rule of law and justice and accountability, these are not things that are going to be achieved under an Abiy government. And that has to be the talking point. Why Abiy is a problem for the United States and for American interests in the Horn, and not just our people are suffering. That is true, but that's not going to be the thing that hooks people in. And so I think part of this is just a messaging piece. And I know it's tough because we all have very raw emotions, but when you're going into a meeting in London or in Ottawa or in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, you have to put a sort of mask on. You have to put a shield on. You have to speak with a certain level of calm and directness, but also a certain level of authority. They respond well to that. And it's not to say that we can't bring the emotion, and the emotion matters too. These examples, these raw examples of atrocities and what that has meant for people in the diaspora, that is important, especially if you are a voter, if you are a constituent. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you're emphasizing that this is an issue for U.S. long-term interests in Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. So I think part of it is just a messaging piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. This was a great panel. I think we got a lot out of it. So I'm going to give everyone a chance, just, a minute or so, because we went way over, to share your final thoughts. We'll start with Mahalet. We'll go Sarah, Sam, and Dr. Ibrahim, and then we'll close out and move on to the Tigrayan portion. Go ahead, Mahalet.
Thanks, Melita. I want to just follow up on what Sam was saying. I think what we could really take from what he said is really about this election right now. the program I was talking about earlier and how we can support Tagata refugees is a program under the Biden administration that was started by the Biden administration. So knowing that a Biden administration or a Kamala administration might not be in office in January means that we're not going to be able to resettle Tagata refugees through this program. So I really just want to follow up on his message and urge everybody to do your civic duty, to participate, to vote, and understand that, like, this administration has provided the Tagaru the ability to resettle our refugees into this country. And it means that, come January, if this administration or, the Democratic administration is not in office, that means we lose the opportunity to resettle these refugees. So I definitely just want to echo that and, urge everybody to vote on Tuesday. And then I also want to just remind everybody that, all of us here can help the refugees. All of us here can work together to get them resettled to this country through this program. You can email us. I've put the emails in the chat, contact@omnatigray.org or helptigray@omnatigray.org. If you want to talk to me personally, Mahlet, MAHLET@omnatigray.org. Let's work together to, use the opportunities that have been provided to us through this administration, the funding that TDA is providing us, and let's see what we can do to get them into this country. And, like we said earlier, our commitments are just focused on helping them integrate into this country for the first 90 days. It's not an immigration process. We're helping get them here through resettlement. So I appreciate the space, and thank you, Milite, and everybody else.
Should I go next, Milite?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And I just wanted to touch on a couple points that Mahlet really quick had mentioned, especially about the human trafficking. This is also an element that also especially impacts the Iro because so much of the population is displaced, and a lot of Iro IDPs have had to find the necessary resources to be able to try to get their family members back. Like, so many of the youth, I mean, this is Tigray-wide, are leaving, right? And so this also affects the Irob, and they're having, already in these IDP camps, the conditions are really dire, and they're having the emotional trauma of this happening to their family member, but they're also having then to find the resources to be able to release, to get their family members released, which is not even guaranteed. So I just wanted to echo that. And I also wanted to add another point on the transitional justice framework and how it, just because of the fact that it is a domestic process, it already excludes any international perpetrators and foreign perpetrators. And this specifically impacts Iro because the majority of the crimes that were committed were by Eritrean forces. And what that means is that we're kind of completely excluding them from that process, because the crimes weren't, some of them were committed by others, but the vast majority were by Eritrean forces, and they committed some of the most horrific crimes, and especially they intentionally transmitted HIV to women across Tigray, the scale of it. And so that's really a big piece, and why I think all of the, these other avenues for justice and accountability that we're exploring, and which are also mentioned in the New Lines report, if we can make it more inclusive and remember that these foreign actors played such a big role in this war as well. It's not just a domestic issue. It never has been, and it never will be. Yeah, so please keep advocating for the Yoruba and remembering them in your advocacy of Tigray. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. The last thing that I would say, sort of a take-home call to action, if you will. One of the things that we as a Tigrayan diaspora have not done a good job at, there's many lessons learned over the last 4 years, but one of the things that I talk a lot about with some friends of mine, and I know Dr. Bitzler could not join us for this panel discussion, but something that she and I talk a lot about is we need to do a better job in getting the message out to other people. I think we stay too much in our own silos as Tigrayans across the world. We have not done a good job in broadening the base of education and awareness, something that Dr. Ibrahim mentioned earlier, partnering with credible universities and other institutions. There are organizations, student organizations on every college campus in the world that are involved in a variety of issues. This coming week, I'm going to be in New York City in a few days, participating in a panel discussion with Dr. Bitzer and Rahwa Berhe at Columbia University Law School, and it's sponsored by their International Human Rights Society. And these are law students that are interested in human rights issues, and the student that is organizing it is someone who has done a lot of Ethiopia work. She's not Ethiopian, she's from Europe, but she's here in the US getting her law degree. And so there are students like that, and there are student clubs like that in every school in the world. And we're not doing a good enough job, I think, in getting the message out there. Our programs cannot always be in Tigrinya. Our protests cannot always be in Tigrinya. Our social media posts cannot always be in Tigrinya. I think there's a huge missed opportunity when we think about a low-hanging fruit. So one thing I would urge everybody, especially if you have young Tigrayan students that are in high school or in college or whatever, encourage them to get involved in their different student organizations, whether it's Model United Nations, or if there's a human rights club, or if there's the African Students Association or other things. Get involved in the structures that already exist. I know some of us, we like to start Tigrayan student associations, or back in the day, Eritrea, Ethiopia student associations. Like, those are nice, but there are broader coalitions that we need to be part of. Samra, I know that you do a lot of work with Black Lives Matter movement in New Hampshire, for instance. Like, get involved in your civic space outside of just being a Tigrayan or an African or an immigrant, and you will notice that there are people who are interested in what's going on, and they just don't know. And it makes sense that they don't know, because there was a very effective communications blackout. And so doing that, I think, is going to help in the long term of building more friends for Tigray. And I think that has to be part of our long-term strategy to make sure that this does not happen again, is the more friends that Tigray has, the more eyes that are on Tigray in the long term, the better. And when it comes time to reconstruction and rehabilitation, we also are going to need people, not just the diaspora, but other friends who are going to be able to visit Tigray and lend their skills and train the local population in different things to be able to rebuild Tigray. And so we're going to need these friends today and in the future. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sam. And final words from Dr. Ibrahim.
No, thank you so much. So I've actually been very thoroughly reassured by the panel discussion and participation. I think your community has really got some fantastic, amazing people that can really make some progress on this issue. I think the real challenge that you have is that this issue is just not in the mainstream kind of language, and I think this is what you have to do, is kind of get it translated. And my key piece of advice, I will be following up obviously on this with our discussion on November 9th, but I think the key point I would try to make is that, from my very limited and humble experience in this field, is that don't ever expect anybody to do the right thing. Yeah, policymakers, don't ever expect them to do what is right, what is moral, and what is just. They just won't. Yeah, there's 1 million people dead in Tigray, there's 2 million dead in Darfur, there's 3 million dead somewhere else. These are just numbers. Yeah, none of them, and these places don't mean anything to them. It really literally means nothing. I can guarantee you, most of them don't even know where Tigray is. Is it a part of Ethiopia? Is it a part of Eritrea? Is it independent? They have no idea. These are just numbers. You have to be able to distill this in a manner in which they understand, and which is in their national strategic interest to actually get involved. So what is that interest? For the European Union, their top priority outside Ukraine is stopping migration. So you have to present it to them in this way, that this is leading to massive instability. For the United States, it's a very different priority. For other countries, it's different. You need to present it in such a way. And also, there has to be a public awareness campaign. I always remember the story, and I always give this story of President Lyndon Johnson when he met with Martin Luther King. He wanted to sign the Civil Rights Act, but he told Martin Luther King, he said, "Make me do it." Yeah, and what he meant by that is not some macho kind of language that, look, you go make me do it, let's see you do it. He said, look, you need to force me to do this. You need to start campus protests. You need to start boycotts. You need to do everything. So I can go to my party leadership and say, look, what the hell? I'm under all this pressure now. We got to do something on this. And this is the same thing for every single issue. Everyone is answerable to somebody. your member of parliament, the minister, the prime minister, even the president will be answerable to his donors and his party. And he or she has to go to their constituency, to their stakeholders and say, look, man, I'm under a lot of pressure here. The Tigrayan community is really breathing down my neck. They're totally harassing me. And, we got to do something on this. Make me do it. You got to make them do it. They're not going to do anything by themselves. It's a complete misunderstanding of how politics works. Nobody is going to do anything by themselves. You need to force them to do it. You need to present it in such a way in which they'll say, look, we've got to do something on this. This is really out of control and going to make things a lot worse for us. And this is where you have to have a comprehensive strategy so that you can make them do it. And so when our call on November 9th, we'll discuss this in a bit more detail. I think there's a lot of things that the Tigrayan community could do. But the key thing is you start off focusing on very, very small, low-hanging fruits in which you can get the communities to work together, get them all, everybody working together, and aim for some small achievements. We'll discuss it a bit more. But once they've got these small achievements, very, very small, easy, everybody's working together, it's an easy win, then you move on to the next thing. But everybody has to work together. But I have been very encouraged and reassured by the discussion we've had today. You've got some really brilliant people. But we just need to kind of now get this coordination, get this energy all going to the right direction and focused like a laser, focused on making these small, small changes until we can make some progress on this issue.
Wow. Thank you so much. This was incredibly powerful. Thank you to everyone who participated in the panel. There were several ways that we're being called to action, and we can do it. We can do it. So I look forward to that conversation on November 9th. Danny promises to get everyone the information so we can all be a part of that conversation. And Sam, when you're at Columbia, ask them if they want to have an archive about what's happening in Tigray. We got to find our university. I feel like that is an easy thing that we can do. And there's probably a dozen universities that would do it. So let's find the right one and put a lot of energy into that. So at the very least, we start that collection, with an independent party. But on that note, thank you all. It's a sad day, but it's a promising day too. So grateful for all of you. Thank you, Dr. Ade. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I will pass it back to Danny.
Yeah, so thank you, Mahalet Gabrabed, thank you, Sarah Siyum, Professor Sam, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you so much. What a great panel. And Melita, you're amazing. Thank you so much for all that you do. So remember, we have 2 panels left, one in Tigray, and then one mental health, a very important panel discussion. So please stay tuned. I'm going to pass to Simon to introduce the Tigray program. Simon, thank you.